The dust settled on the old wooden porch as Olivia Newell stared out at the horizon, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains but seeing nothing, her lips sealed by grief so profound it had stolen her voice 3 months ago when they'd buried James beside the creek where they'd first met. The silence that surrounded her wasn't just the quiet of the Wyoming prairie in 1876. It was the hollowness of a woman who had lost everything and found no reason to speak to the world that had taken it all away. The small ranch house sat like a lonely sentinel against the backdrop of endless sky, a home once filled with laughter, now echoing with emptiness. At 26, Olivia had already experienced more tragedy than most would in a lifetime. The life she had built with James over 6 years of marriage had crumbled when the fever took him, leaving her alone with acres of land, a handful of cattle, and memories that haunted every corner of their property. Her days had fallen into a ritual of necessary tasks, feeding chickens, tending the vegetable garden, and sitting. Always sitting on that porch as the sun rose and set, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders regardless of the temperature, her honey-brown hair often escaping its loose braid, her blue eyes vacant. The townsfolk of Clearwater Springs had tried at first. They'd brought food, offered help, attempted conversation, but Olivia's silence had eventually discouraged even the most persistent visitors. Doc Miller called it shock of the spirit, and said only time would heal it. But time was passing, and Olivia remained locked within herself, moving through her days like a ghost in her own life. That morning began like all the others. Olivia rose before dawn, dressed mechanically in a simple blue dress worn thin at the elbows, and stepped outside to greet another day without purpose. The late summer air carried the scent of sage and pine from the nearby foothills. She settled into the rocking chair James had made during their first year of marriage, her hands resting in her lap, still as stones. She might have remained there all day if not for the distant figure that appeared on the horizon, a lone rider whose silhouette gradually took shape against the morning sky. Visitors were rare this far from town, and unwelcome. Olivia considered retreating inside, but something about the steady approach of the stranger kept her rooted to her chair. As the rider drew closer, she could make out more details: a man on a dappled gray horse, his hat pulled low against the morning sun, his shoulders broad beneath a weathered leather vest. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life in the saddle, unhurried but purposeful. When he reached the edge of her property, he slowed his horse to a walk, allowing her ample time to observe his approach or flee inside if she chose. It was a courtesy not all travelers offered to a woman alone. As he neared the house, Olivia could see his face beneath the shadow of his hat, a man perhaps 30 years of age, with a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of beard, and eyes the color of the amber whiskey James used to drink on special occasions. The stranger stopped his horse a respectful distance from the porch and removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar. "Madam," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Pardon the intrusion. Name's Isaac Lawson. I've been riding since dawn and wondered if I might trouble you for some water for my horse and myself. If you're willing." Olivia stared at him, her expression unchanged. In the months of her silence, she had developed a series of gestures and nods to communicate essential responses. Now, she inclined her head slightly toward the well at the side of the house, granting permission without words. Isaac Lawson studied her for a moment, his eyes showing a flicker of curiosity but no pity, a refreshing change from the looks she usually received. "Much obliged," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. He led his horse to the well, his spurs making a faint jingling sound against the packed earth. While he drew water, Olivia watched him from beneath lowered lashes. There was something both worn and unbending about him, like a tree that had weathered many storms but remained standing. His clothes were dusty from the trail but of good quality, and the revolver at his hip appeared well maintained, but not ostentatious like those carried by men trying to cultivate a dangerous reputation. After watering his horse, Isaac filled a tin cup for himself, drinking deeply before returning to stand at the bottom of the porch steps. "Fine property you have here," he said, his eyes scanning the modest ranch with genuine appreciation. "The land has good bones." He paused, seeming to sense her discomfort with conversation, even one-sided. "I don't mean to impose. Just passing through on my way north to the Tetons. Tracking work's dried up around these parts." Olivia's eyes flickered with the barest interest. Trackers were uncommon visitors in Clearwater Springs. Most were either hunting bounties or employed by wealthy Easterners on hunting expeditions. Isaac seemed to read her unspoken question. "I guide for the Geological Survey mostly, mapping new territories, identifying resources." He smiled slightly. "Less exciting than hunting outlaws, but it keeps me fed and out under the open sky." He glanced at the paddock where a chestnut mare grazed alone. "That's a fine horse. Morgan breed?" Olivia nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thought so. Good stock." He looked around at the unmistakable signs of a property being maintained by a single pair of hands: the leaning fence rail, the overgrown garden edges, the weathered paint on the house trim. His eyes returned to Olivia, taking in her slender frame and the fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "Madam, I don't mean to be forward, but I'm handy with tools and have some time before I need to meet my survey crew. I'd be happy to tend to a few repairs in exchange for a place to set my bedroll for the night." "Out by the barn would be fine." Olivia's eyes widened slightly. It had been so long since anyone had offered help without an undercurrent of charity or pity. This stranger was proposing a fair exchange work for shelter, treating her as a property owner rather than an object of sympathy. After a long moment, she gave a single nod. "Thank you kindly," Isaac said, replacing his hat. "I'll see to my horse and then get started on that fence. Just point me to where you keep your tools." Olivia rose from her chair for the first time that morning and led him to the small shed adjacent to the barn. Inside were James's tools, untouched since his passing. She gestured to them and then stepped back, watching as Isaac selected what he needed with knowledge and care. "These are good tools," he said softly. "Well cared for." He looked up at her, and something in his expression told her he understood these belonged to someone no longer present. "I'll treat them with respect, madam." Olivia returned to her porch, but instead of resuming her usual vacant staring, she found herself watching as Isaac worked. His movements were economical and skilled as he repaired the paddock fence, replacing rotted posts and securing loose rails. He worked steadily through the morning, stopping only to drink water and check on his horse. By midday, the fence was solid again, and Isaac had moved on to the barn door that had been hanging crooked for months. Olivia rose and went inside, returning a short while later with a plate containing cornbread and cold venison. She set it on the porch railing and returned to her chair. Isaac noticed the food when he came to refill his water cup. "That's mighty kind of you," he said, taking the plate and sitting on the bottom step to eat. He didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary words, seeming comfortable with the quiet that Olivia wrapped around herself like a protective cloak. As the afternoon wore on, Olivia found herself drawn from her chair. She collected eggs from the chicken coop and tended her small garden, always aware of Isaac's presence as he moved from one repair to another. There was something steadying about having another person on the property, someone who expected nothing from her beyond the simple agreement they had made. When evening fell, Isaac had repaired the fence, fixed the barn door, patched a leak in the water trough, and cleaned the chimney. He unsaddled his horse and brushed him down before leading him into the paddock with Olivia's mare. "Hope you don't mind them sharing space," he said when he noticed her watching. "Ajax is well-mannered with other horses." Olivia nodded, then gestured toward the house, where smoke now rose from the chimney. She had prepared a simple supper more than she usually bothered with for herself alone. Isaac washed up at the pump, smoothing his hair with wet hands before following her inside. The cabin was small but clean, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and a sitting area with a rocking chair and small sofa. A doorway covered by a curtain presumably led to a bedroom. The table was set for two, with bowls of rabbit stew and more cornbread. Isaac waited for Olivia to sit before taking his own place across from her. "This is the finest meal I've had in months," he said after his first bite. "Trail food gets mighty tiresome." They ate in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before, less empty. Somehow. After they finished, Isaac insisted on washing the dishes while Olivia dried them and put them away. The domestic routine felt both foreign and familiar to her, a remembered dance from a life that seemed increasingly distant. As darkness settled completely outside, Isaac thanked her for the meal and picked up his bedroll, prepared to head out to the barn as agreed. Olivia surprised herself by gesturing to the sofa instead. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm perfectly comfortable in a barn. Spent many nights in worse places." She nodded firmly, then brought him a blanket and pillow from a trunk in the corner. "Thank you, Mrs.?" He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. Olivia hesitated, then moved to a shelf and took down a Bible. Opening to the front page, she pointed to an inscription. "To Olivia and James Newell, may your home be blessed with love and laughter. Wedding day, June 12th, 1870. "Mrs. Newell," Isaac said softly, "I'm honored by your hospitality." She nodded once more, then retreated behind the curtain to her bedroom, leaving Isaac to settle on the sofa. That night, for the first time in months, Olivia slept without nightmares. Perhaps it was exhaustion from doing more physical work than usual, or perhaps it was the comforting knowledge that she wasn't completely alone in the darkness. Morning came with the crowing of the rooster and the smell of coffee. Olivia emerged from her room to find Isaac had risen early and started breakfast. He had fried salt pork and was cooking eggs in the rendered fat. "Hope you don't mind," he said when he saw her. "Thought I'd make myself useful before heading out." Olivia shook her head to indicate she didn't mind, then moved to the cupboard to get plates. They worked around each other in the small kitchen space with surprising ease, as if they'd done it many times before. Over breakfast, Isaac spoke of his plans. "I'm due to meet the survey team near Jackson in 4 days. Plenty of time to get there, even at an easy pace." He hesitated. "Mrs. Newell, there's still quite a bit that needs attention around your property. If you're amenable, I could stay another day or two. There's that roof shingle that's working loose, and your water pump could use some new leather washers." Olivia considered his offer. The practical part of her knew the repairs were necessary and would be more difficult to manage alone. Another part, one she barely recognized, simply didn't want to return to the oppressive silence that had been her only companion for months. She nodded her agreement, and something that might have been relief flickered across Isaac's face. They fell into a rhythm over the next days. Isaac worked on repairs while Olivia tended to her usual chores, now with more energy and purpose than before. They took their meals together, with Isaac filling the silence with stories of his travels, the majestic peaks of Montana, the vast expanse of the Dakotas, the hidden valleys of Colorado. He spoke of his work with the survey teams, mapping areas that had never been properly documented, discovering waterfalls and hot springs unknown to any but the native tribes. Olivia listened, finding comfort in his deep voice and the vivid pictures he painted with his words. He never pressed her to speak, never looked at her with expectation or frustration when she communicated through gestures. He simply accepted her silence as part of who she was, adapting to it with natural ease. On the evening of the second day, they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Isaac had brought his coffee cup outside, and the aroma mingled with the scent of pine carried on the cooling air. "My father was a quiet man," Isaac said after a companionable silence. "Went months sometimes, barely speaking more than was necessary. My mother used to say he had used up all his words in his youth and was saving the rest for his old age." He smiled at the memory. "He taught me that listening often tells you more than talking ever could." He glanced at Olivia, who was watching him with unexpected intensity. "I imagine you hear plenty, Mrs. Newell, even without adding your own voice to the conversation." Olivia felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking up on a river in early spring. She reached for the small slate and chalk she kept for necessary communications with traders and turned it toward Isaac. "Yes," she wrote in neat, precise letters. "Too much. Sometimes." Isaac's eyes widened slightly at this first direct communication, but he controlled his surprise quickly. "I can understand that. World can be mighty loud even in the quiet places." She erased the slate with her sleeve and wrote again. "Thank you for not asking why." "Some things don't need explaining," he replied softly. "Pain has its own language." They sat in silence until the stars emerged, bright pinpricks against the velvet darkness. When Olivia finally rose to go inside, she paused at the door and wrote one more message before handing him the slate. "Your voice is peaceful, like rain on the roof." Isaac read the words twice before looking up at her, something warm kindling in his amber eyes. "That might be the finest compliment I've ever received, Mrs. Newell." The third day brought a change in the weather, with dark clouds gathering on the western horizon by mid-morning. Isaac worked with increased urgency, finishing the roof repairs before the rain could arrive. Olivia brought supplies in from the garden and secured the chicken coop, her movements more decisive than they had been in months. When the first fat raindrops began to fall, they retreated to the house, closing the windows against the coming storm. The temperature dropped quickly as thunder rumbled in the distance. "This looks to be a significant system moving through," Isaac observed, looking out at the darkening sky. "Might last into tomorrow." Olivia nodded, then moved to build up the fire against the unexpected chill. As she knelt by the hearth, arranging kindling beneath the logs, a particularly loud crack of thunder directly overhead startled her. She dropped the piece of wood she was holding and instinctively covered her ears. Isaac was beside her in an instant, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said softly. "Just the sky clearing its throat." The unexpected humor of his description made something inside Olivia shift, and before she could control it, a small sound escaped her, not quite a laugh, but the ghost of one. She looked up at Isaac in surprise, her hand moving to her throat. His eyes were warm with understanding but not pity. "Let me finish with the fire," he said, taking the kindling from her trembling fingers. "You've been on your feet all day." As the storm intensified outside, they settled into a companionable indoor routine. Isaac brought in more firewood from the covered stack by the door, while Olivia prepared a stew for supper, adding extra potatoes and carrots from her garden. The domestic scene might have seemed ordinary to an observer, but for Olivia, it represented a profound shift from the isolated existence she had inhabited since James's death. After they ate, Isaac reached into his saddlebag and produced a deck of cards. "Care for a game?" he asked. "Nothing serious, just to pass the time while the storm blows through." Olivia hesitated, then nodded. They cleared the table and Isaac shuffled the cards with practiced hands. "My mother wouldn't allow these in the house," he said with a smile. "Called them the devil's picture books. My father taught me to play anyway. Said it was important to understand how men thought when they had money on the line." He dealt the cards for a simple game of vingt et un. "We'll just play for matchsticks if that suits you." The evening passed with the rhythmic sound of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Isaac kept the conversation light, telling amusing stories about characters he'd met in his travels: the English lord who wanted to hunt buffalo while wearing a top hat, the prospector who claimed his mule could smell gold, the frontier cook who threatened to shoot anyone who complained about his biscuits. For the first time in months, Olivia felt something like peace settle over her. The persistent ache of grief was still there, a dull throb beneath her ribs, but it no longer consumed her every waking thought. In its place was a fragile awareness of the present moment: the warmth of the fire, the comfort of another human presence, the simple pleasure of a game with no consequences. When they finally put the cards away, the storm had settled into a steady, gentle rain. Isaac banked the fire for the night while Olivia prepared for bed. At her bedroom curtain, she turned and looked at him, wanting to express something of what the evening had meant to her, but finding no way to form the words, even on her slate. Isaac seemed to understand nonetheless. "Sleep well, Mrs. Newell," he said softly. "The storm's moving east. Should be clear by morning." She nodded and disappeared behind the curtain, but before she fell asleep, she heard him add in a voice barely above a whisper, "Thank you for a fine evening." The rain continued through the night and into the next morning, transforming the dusty yard into mud and filling the air with the scent of wet earth and vegetation. Olivia woke to find Isaac already up, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the gray skies. "Good morning," he said when he heard her moving behind him. "Afraid the weather isn't cooperating with my travel plans." He turned to face her, his expression apologetic. "I should reach Jackson by tomorrow evening, but I'll need to ride out today, rain or not." Olivia felt an unexpected pang at his words. In just 3 days, Isaac Lawson had somehow breached the walls of isolation she had built around herself. The thought of returning to her silent, solitary existence made her chest tighten with something close to panic. She reached for her slate. "Roads will be dangerous. Creeks flood quickly here." Isaac studied her message, then her face. "Are you suggesting I delay my departure?" She hesitated, then wrote, "Until midday at least. Rain may stop." "The survey team will wait an extra day if needed," he said, watching her carefully. "They're used to weather delays." Relief washed over Olivia, though she tried not to show it too plainly. She nodded and moved to prepare breakfast, aware of Isaac's thoughtful gaze following her movements. They spent the morning indoors, with Isaac repairing some of the smaller items Olivia had set aside: a broken chair rung, a loose cabinet hinge, the handle of a pot that had come detached. She worked on mending clothes, sitting near the window for better light. The domesticity of the scene struck her as both strange and comforting, like finding a familiar object in an unexpected place. By midday, as Olivia had predicted, the rain began to taper off. Patches of blue appeared between the clouds, and sunlight broke through intermittently, creating steam from the wet ground. "Looks like the weather's breaking," Isaac observed, moving to stand beside her at the window. "I should be able to make good time this afternoon if I leave soon." Olivia felt the walls closing in again, the silence waiting to reclaim her. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm, the first time she had initiated physical contact. When he looked down at her in surprise, she quickly wrote on her slate, "Stay for lunch before you go." Isaac's expression softened. "I'd like that very much." They prepared the meal together, using the last of the previous night's stew with fresh cornbread. As they ate, Isaac spoke of his plans after the survey job was complete. "I've been thinking of settling somewhere eventually," he said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "A man can't live on the trail forever. These bones aren't getting any younger." He smiled ruefully. "Been saving for a place of my own. Something modest, with good water, and enough grazing for a few horses." Olivia listened, trying to imagine Isaac Lawson confined to one place after so many years of wandering. It seemed as improbable as herself speaking again, a possibility so distant it was barely worth considering. All too soon, the meal was finished, and Isaac rose to gather his belongings. Olivia wrote a brief note instructing him on the safest route to avoid the areas most likely to flood after heavy rain. He studied it carefully, then folded the paper and tucked it into his vest pocket. "I'm much obliged for this, and for your hospitality these past days," he said as they stood by the door. "It's been—" He paused, searching for the right words. "It's been a rare pleasure, Mrs. Newell." Olivia quickly wrote on her slate, "You can call me Olivia." A smile warmed his eyes. "Olivia, then. And I'm Isaac to my friends." She nodded, accepting the implicit statement that they had, indeed, become friends during his brief stay. Outside, the sun had emerged fully, turning puddles into mirrors reflecting the blue sky. Isaac saddled Ajax, checking the cinch twice before securing his bedroll and saddlebags. When everything was ready, he turned to Olivia one last time. "I'll be coming back this way in about 3 weeks, once the survey is complete," he said. "With your permission, I'd like to stop by. There's still that chicken coop roof that needs attention." Olivia felt her heart lighten at his words. She nodded, then impulsively wrote, "I'll have apple pie." Isaac's laugh was warm and genuine. Now that's something to look forward to. He mounted Ajax with fluid grace, settling into the saddle and gathering the reins. "Take care, Olivia. I'll see you soon." She watched him ride away, standing on the porch until his figure disappeared over the distant rise. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the emptiness that settled over the property in his absence, an emptiness that felt different from before, tinged now with anticipation rather than despair. The days that followed were both similar to and utterly different from the months of isolation that had preceded Isaac's arrival. Olivia continued her daily chores, but she approached them with more purpose. She thoroughly cleaned the house, airing out rooms that had been closed for too long. She weeded the garden with care and harvested the late summer vegetables, preserving some for the coming winter. At night, she would sit on the porch and look at the stars, remembering Isaac's stories about using them for navigation across the vast western territories. Sometimes she would touch her throat, wondering if the words were still there, buried beneath layers of grief and silence. 2 weeks after Isaac's departure, Olivia had an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Thomas Palmer rode up one afternoon, his expression concerned as he dismounted in front of her porch. "Mrs. Newell," he said, removing his hat. "Hope you're keeping well." Olivia nodded in greeting, wondering what had brought the sheriff all the way from town. She hadn't been to Clearwater Springs in over a month. "Mrs. Miller at the general store was worried when you didn't come in for your usual supplies," he explained. "Asked me to check on you next time I was out this way." Olivia reached for the slate she now kept on the small table beside her rocking chair. "I am fine. Thank you for your concern." The sheriff seemed relieved at this direct communication more than she had offered in previous encounters. "Glad to hear it. Do you need anything from town?" "I'm heading back tomorrow." She considered for a moment, then wrote, "Flour and sugar, if convenient. For baking." Sheriff Palmer's eyebrows rose slightly at this. Before her husband's death, Olivia had been known for her baking, often bringing pies and cakes to town gatherings. She hadn't baked anything in months. "Be happy to bring those out to you," he said. "Anything else?" Olivia shook her head, then wrote, "I will pay you when you return." "No rush on that," he assured her. His eyes moved over the property, noting the recent repairs. "Place is looking good. Did you hire help?" A traveler stopped for water. "Offered to make repairs in exchange for meals and lodging." The sheriff frowned slightly. "What traveler would this be? Don't recall any strangers in town recently." "Isaac Lawson, works for the Geological Survey. He was passing through to meet his team near Jackson." Sheriff Palmer relaxed visibly. "Ah, I know of Lawson. Solid reputation. Still, Mrs. Newell, you should be careful about strangers. A woman alone." He trailed off, not wanting to lecture her. Olivia appreciated his concern, but found herself mildly annoyed by the implication that she couldn't judge a man's character for herself. She wrote, "Mr. Lawson was a gentleman. He will be stopping again on his return journey." "Is that so?" The sheriff studied her with new interest. "Well, that's good then. Extra pair of hands never hurts around a ranch." He replaced his hat. "I'll bring those supplies out tomorrow afternoon, if that suits." Olivia nodded her thanks, and the sheriff rode away, glancing back once with a thoughtful expression. She knew the news of Isaac's visit and planned return would be all over town by evening. Clearwater Springs thrived on such tidbits of information, especially concerning a widow who had withdrawn so completely from the community. She found she didn't mind. Let them talk. For the first time since James's death, she was looking forward rather than backward, anticipating something beyond the next sunrise. The next day, true to his word, Sheriff Palmer returned with flour, sugar, and several other items Mrs. Miller had included: fresh coffee beans, a small jar of cinnamon, and a packet of hard candies. Just because. Olivia paid for the goods and wrote a note of thanks to be delivered to the storekeeper. As the sheriff was leaving, he paused. "Mrs. Newell, some of the ladies in town were wondering if you might like company now and again." Mrs. Peterson mentioned she could stop by for tea sometime. Olivia considered the offer. A month ago, she would have declined immediately, unable to bear the thought of forcing herself through social niceties. Now, though, she felt differently. Perhaps it was time to reconnect, at least in small ways. She wrote, "That would be nice. Next week, perhaps." Sheriff Palmer looked genuinely pleased. "I'll let her know. Take care now, Mrs. Newell." After he left, Olivia brought the supplies inside and began organizing her kitchen for baking. She couldn't remember the last time she had made an apple pie, but her hands remembered the motions mixing the dough, rolling it out to the right thickness, preparing the filling with cinnamon and just the right amount of sugar. As she worked, she hummed softly a sound so unexpected that she froze when she became conscious of it. The simple melody had been one James used to whistle while he worked. Olivia pressed a flour-covered hand to her lips, then to her throat, feeling the vibration that had created the sound. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that her voice might not be gone forever. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The 3 weeks since Isaac's departure stretched into 4, and Olivia tried not to worry. Survey work was unpredictable, she told herself. Weather, terrain difficulties, or equipment problems could cause delays. Still, she found herself watching the horizon more often, hoping to see a rider approaching. Mrs. Peterson came for tea as planned, bringing fresh gossip and a gentle but determined effort to draw Olivia back into the community. She didn't seem bothered by Olivia's written responses, carrying the conversation easily enough for both of them. When she left, she extended an invitation to Sunday services, which Olivia accepted with a nod, surprising both of them. That Sunday marked Olivia's first visit to town in months. She wore her best dress, a deep green that James had always favored, and drove herself in the small wagon. People greeted her warmly, if a bit cautiously, careful not to overwhelm her with questions or sympathy. She sat through the service feeling both exposed and strangely protected by the familiar ritual. Afterward, she declined invitations to dinner, but accepted a small package of butter cookies from Mrs. Miller with a written promise to share her next batch of apple pie. The connection, however tentative, felt like a small victory over the isolation that had consumed her for so long. It was the following Wednesday when Olivia finally spotted a rider approaching from the north. She had been hanging laundry, the clean sheets snapping in the autumn breeze, when movement on the horizon caught her eye. She shaded her eyes against the late morning sun, her heart quickening as she recognized the dappled gray horse and the straight-backed figure of its rider. Isaac saw her at the same moment and raised his hat in greeting. Olivia found herself smiling, a small, rusty expression that felt foreign on her face, but not unwelcome. She finished hanging the last sheet, then moved to the porch to wait for him, smoothing her hair and straightening her apron in a moment of self-consciousness that would have amused her if she'd stopped to think about it. As Isaac drew closer, she could see changes in him. His beard was fuller, his skin more tanned from weeks in the open, and there was a new weariness in the set of his shoulders. When he dismounted in front of the porch, she also noticed he was favoring his left leg slightly. "Olivia," he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure, "it's good to see you." She nodded in greeting, then pointed to his leg with a questioning look. Isaac grimaced. "Had a disagreement with a rock slide about a week ago. Nothing broken, just bruised pretty badly." He led Ajax toward the water trough. The survey took longer than expected. Terrain was more difficult than the maps indicated, and we lost 3 days to an early snowstorm in the high country. Olivia retrieved her slate from the porch and wrote, "You're welcome to rest here as long as needed." Isaac read the message and looked up with a grateful smile. "I appreciate that. I'll earn my keep, though. Still have that chicken coop to fix. Once this leg is a bit more cooperative." She wrote again, "No hurry. Dinner first. You look hungry." He laughed. "I could eat a bear, and I've actually had bear meat, so I know what I'm saying." He patted Ajax's neck. "Let me tend to this fellow first. He's carried me faithfully through some rough country." Olivia nodded and went inside to prepare a meal while Isaac cared for his horse. She had been cooking more regularly in recent weeks, rediscovering the satisfaction of creating something with her hands. Today, she had venison stew simmering on the stove and fresh bread cooling on the counter. And, true to her promise, an apple pie waited on the windowsill. When Isaac entered the cabin, he stopped just inside the door, inhaling deeply. "That," he said with reverence, "smells like heaven itself." Olivia felt a flush of pleasure at his appreciation. She gestured for him to sit while she served the meal, noticing how he eased himself carefully into the chair, his movements stiff from injury and long days in the saddle. They ate in companionable silence at first, Isaac too hungry, and Olivia too content with his presence to need conversation. When the edge of his hunger was satisfied, Isaac began sharing stories from his journey, the spectacular views from mountain ridges, the hidden valleys they had mapped, the encounter with a mother bear and cubs that had sent the survey team scrambling up trees. "Matheson, he's the lead surveyor, wanted to name a small peak after me because I found the only passable route through a particularly nasty section," Isaac said with a chuckle. "I told him I'd rather have a good meal and a hot bath than my name on a mountain nobody will ever visit again." Olivia smiled at this, imagining the scene. She wrote on her slate, "Did you get either?" "The meal, yes. Mrs. Matheson is a fine cook. The bath had to wait until we reached Jackson." He grimaced comically. "By then, I reckon I could have stood the washcloth up by itself." After they finished eating, Isaac insisted on helping with the dishes despite his sore leg. As they worked side by side, he told her more about the survey team and their findings, valuable mineral deposits that would likely bring prospectors to the region within a year, new routes that could make travel easier for settlers, pristine lakes teeming with fish. "It's changing fast," he said, his voice turning reflective. 10 years ago, much of that country had never been seen by white men. Now we're mapping every hill and valley, marking where the railroads might go, where towns could be built." He handed her the last plate to dry. "Progress, they call it. Sometimes I wonder." Olivia understood his ambivalence. She wrote, "Beautiful things are often destroyed in the name of progress." Isaac read her words and nodded slowly. "That's the truth of it. I've seen places so perfect, so untouched, it seemed almost a sin to mark them on a map, knowing what would follow." He smiled ruefully. "Yet, here I am, doing exactly that work." "We all have contradictions," she wrote. "Wise words," he acknowledged. Speaking of which, I believe I was promised apple pie. The evening passed in comfort and conversation mostly one-sided but no less meaningful for that. Isaac spoke of his childhood in Ohio, his father's work as a blacksmith, his mother's dreams of seeing him become a schoolteacher. He told Olivia about his first journey west at 19, working as a teamster for a merchant wagon train, and how the vast open spaces had called to something in his soul. I tried going back east once, he said as they sat by the fire after supper. Lasted less than a month before the buildings started closing in on me. Needed sky overhead, not ceilings. Olivia nodded in understanding. She had been born in Pennsylvania but had never felt at home there. Meeting James, who had already spent time in the Wyoming territory and spoke eloquently of its beauty, had given her the courage to leave everything familiar behind. She had never regretted it, even in her darkest days of grief. As the fire burned low, Isaac's stories began to wind down, his voice growing softer with fatigue. Olivia saw the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes and wrote, "You should rest. Your room is ready." Isaac looked surprised. "My room?" She pointed toward the small second bedroom that had once been intended for children, a hope that had never materialized during her marriage. She had cleaned it thoroughly the week before, airing out the bedding and sweeping away the dust of disuse. "That's mighty kind," Isaac said, clearly touched by the gesture. "But I don't want to impose. The sofa served me well enough before." Olivia shook her head firmly and wrote, "Not an imposition. You need proper rest to heal." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Olivia. I won't argue with such generous hospitality." Before retiring, he limped out to check on Ajax one last time, returning with his saddlebags. Olivia showed him to the small bedroom, where a lamp burned low on the bedside table, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings. "Sleep well," she wrote on her slate before leaving him to settle in. "And you," he replied softly. "Thank you for making a weary traveler feel welcome." That night, Olivia lay awake longer than usual, acutely aware of another person's presence in her home. It wasn't an uncomfortable feeling, quite the opposite. There was something profoundly reassuring about Isaac's steady breathing in the next room. The occasional creak of the bed as he shifted position. The house felt alive again in a way it hadn't since James's death. She touched her throat in the darkness, wondering if the words would ever come back, if she would ever be able to answer Isaac's stories with her own. The thought no longer seemed as impossible as it once had. The following days established a new routine. Isaac's leg improved gradually, allowing him to take on small tasks around the property. True to his word, he repaired the chicken coop roof and several other items that had been neglected. Olivia continued her normal chores, but now there was conversation, or at least Isaac's half of it, to accompany the work. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, with Isaac reading aloud from one of the few books Olivia owned or telling more stories of his travels. Sometimes they played cards, with Olivia occasionally writing humorous observations that made Isaac laugh, a sound she found herself craving more and more. A week passed in this manner, and neither of them mentioned Isaac's eventual departure. There was an unspoken understanding that he would move on. He always did, but the when of it remained undefined. Olivia tried not to think about it, focusing instead on the present comfort of his company. On Sunday, Mrs. Peterson stopped by after church services, ostensibly to bring a jar of preserves, but clearly curious about the man whose horse was visible in the paddock. Olivia introduced them with written notes, and Mrs. Peterson engaged Isaac in friendly conversation, her shrewd eyes missing nothing about the comfortable domesticity that had developed between the tracker and the widow. "Mr. Lawson, we're having a harvest social at the church next Saturday," she said as she prepared to leave. "Nothing fancy, just good food and company. You and Mrs. Newell would be most welcome." Isaac glanced at Olivia. "That's very kind, madam. I'll defer to Mrs. Newell on social engagements. Olivia hesitated. She had avoided town gatherings even before James's death, finding them overwhelming. But with Isaac beside her, perhaps it would be different. She wrote, "We will try to attend. Thank you." Mrs. Peterson looked pleased and slightly surprised. "Wonderful. Everyone will be so glad to see you both." Her emphasis on the last word was subtle but unmistakable. After she left, Isaac turned to Olivia with a raised eyebrow. "I hope I didn't put you in an awkward position. We don't have to go if you'd rather not." She wrote, "It's time I rejoined the world a little. Easier with a friend." His expression softened. "I'd be honored to accompany you, Olivia." Then, with a twinkle in his eye, he added, "Though I should warn you, I dance about as gracefully as a three-legged mule." The image made Olivia smile, and she wrote, "Perfect. I haven't danced in years. We'll stumble together." The days leading up to the social took on a new energy. Olivia found herself paying more attention to preparations than she had expected, washing her best dress, polishing her rarely worn shoes, even experimenting with different ways of arranging her hair. Isaac, too, seemed invested in making a good impression. He trimmed his beard neatly and asked to borrow Olivia's flat iron to press his one good shirt. On Saturday afternoon, they hitched Olivia's mare to the wagon and set off for town, with Ajax following behind on a lead rope. Olivia wore her green dress with a cream-colored shawl, her hair swept up more elegantly than usual. Isaac had managed to transform himself from rugged tracker to respectable gentleman, though his tan face and calloused hands still marked him as a man who lived by outdoor work. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he helped her into the wagon. Olivia felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. She smoothed her skirt and nodded her thanks, not trusting herself to write a response that wouldn't reveal how much his words affected her. The church hall was decorated with autumn leaves and late-blooming wildflowers when they arrived. Lanterns cast a warm glow over long tables laden with food, and a small group of musicians was setting up in one corner. Several people greeted Olivia with genuine pleasure, though she noted the curious glances directed at Isaac. Sheriff Palmer approached them early in the evening, extending his hand to Isaac. "Mr. Lawson, good to meet you properly. I've heard of your work with the survey teams. Important contribution to the territory's development." "Sheriff," Isaac acknowledged with a nod. "Just doing my job, but I appreciate the sentiment." "Mrs. Newell," the sheriff continued, turning to Olivia. "Glad you could join us tonight. Been too long since we've seen you at a town gathering." Olivia nodded, feeling a familiar anxiety rise at being the center of attention. Isaac seemed to sense her discomfort and smoothly redirected the conversation, asking the sheriff about local conditions and recent developments in the territory. His natural ease in social situations allowed Olivia to relax and observe rather than participate directly. As the evening progressed, Olivia found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of community more than she had expected. Mrs. Miller shared town news, Mr. Peterson discussed the likely winter weather patterns, and young Sarah Jenkins proudly showed Olivia her needlework sampler. Throughout it all, Isaac remained close by, occasionally translating Olivia's written responses for others, or gently steering conversations when they became too personal or difficult. When the musicians began playing in earnest, several couples moved to the cleared area for dancing. Olivia watched them with a mixture of nostalgia and longing. James had been an enthusiastic, if not particularly skilled dancer, often coaxing her to join in, despite her natural reserve. Isaac leaned close to speak over the music. "Would you care to dance, Olivia? I meant what I said about my lack of grace, but I can at least avoid stepping on your toes most of the time." She hesitated, then wrote on her small slate, "I would like that." He led her to the edge of the dancing area, then turned to face her with a formal bow that made her smile despite her nervousness. "May I have the honor?" Olivia placed her hand in his and allowed him to guide her into the simple pattern of a country waltz. His hand at her waist was warm and steady, providing gentle pressure to signal turns and changes. Despite his self-deprecation, Isaac moved with natural coordination, and Olivia found herself following his lead without difficulty. "You're a fine dancer," he murmured as they turned. "Light as a feather on your feet." She felt herself flush with pleasure at the compliment. For a moment she wished desperately that she could respond aloud, tell him how safe she felt in his arms, how the music seemed to flow through her for the first time in ages. Instead, she met his eyes and hoped he could read what she couldn't say. Something in his expression suggested he understood. His hand tightened slightly at her waist, drawing her a fraction closer as they continued to move in time with the music. The evening continued with more dancing, conversation, and abundant food. By the time they prepared to leave, Olivia felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The social interaction had depleted energy she didn't realize she possessed, yet there was also a sense of accomplishment, of having overcome a barrier she had believed insurmountable. As they drove home under a canopy of stars, Isaac spoke softly about the evening, the people he had met, the stories he had heard, the excellent apple cobbler Mrs. Johnson had brought. "Though not nearly as good as your pie," he assured Olivia. His gentle conversation required no response, allowing her to process the experience in comfortable silence. When they reached the ranch, Isaac helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. "Thank you for allowing me to escort you tonight," he said. "It was a privilege." Olivia looked up at him in the moonlight, struck by the sincerity in his amber eyes. On impulse, she reached for his hand and squeezed it gently before releasing it to write on her slate, "Thank you for making it possible." They cared for the horses together, then went inside, moving around each other with the easy familiarity that had developed over the past weeks. As Olivia prepared for bed, she realized with sudden clarity that Isaac had become essential to her daily life in a way she hadn't allowed anyone to be since James. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. The following morning brought a change in the weather, a sharp drop in temperature and clouds gathering on the northern horizon. Isaac studied the sky with a tracker's experienced eye as they stood on the porch after breakfast. "Snow coming," he predicted. "First of the season, I'd wager. Might amount to something significant." Olivia nodded in agreement. She had lived in Wyoming long enough to recognize the signs. She wrote, "We should prepare. Bring in extra firewood and check the livestock." They spent the day making winter preparations that Olivia had been postponing. Isaac split additional firewood and stacked it on the covered porch while she harvested the last of the garden vegetables and secured the chicken coop against cold drafts. Together, they checked the barn roof for weak spots and reinforced the paddock shelter where the horses would need protection from the elements. By late afternoon, the first snowflakes were drifting down, small and dry at first, then becoming larger and more numerous as twilight approached. They finished the outdoor work just as the snow began to accumulate, retreating to the warmth of the cabin as darkness fell. "Perfect timing," Isaac said, stamping snow from his boots at the door. "Nothing like being inside with a warm fire when winter makes its first appearance." Olivia smiled in agreement as she stirred the stew she had left simmering on the stove. There was indeed something deeply satisfying about being safely sheltered while nature demonstrated its power outside. The fact that she wasn't facing the storm alone made it almost pleasant rather than merely endurable. After supper, they sat by the fire, listening to the wind picking up outside. Isaac had been unusually quiet during the meal, and Olivia sensed he had something on his mind. Finally, he cleared his throat and turned to face her more directly. "Olivia, I need to talk to you about something," he began, his expression serious. "I've received a letter from the survey office in Cheyenne. They're offering me a new assignment starting next month." She felt her heart sink, but kept her face composed, waiting for him to continue. It would mean traveling to Arizona Territory for the winter months. They're mapping areas around the Colorado River, places that are too hot to work efficiently in summer. He paused. It's good pay, and the work is interesting. I'd be gone until spring. Olivia reached for her slate with hands that weren't quite steady. When would you leave? Within the week, if I accept, he replied. I'd need to reach Cheyenne by the 15th to meet the team and gather supplies. She nodded slowly, processing this information. Of course Isaac would move on. It was the nature of his work, the life he had chosen. She had always known his stay was temporary, a brief interlude in his journeying existence. That she had allowed herself to imagine otherwise was her own folly. It's a good opportunity, she wrote, keeping her message simple and supportive despite the hollow feeling expanding in her chest. Isaac studied her face. Yes, he said quietly, but I find myself reluctant. Olivia looked up sharply, questioning. These past weeks, he continued, choosing his words with care, have meant a great deal to me, Olivia. More than I expected. More than I can properly express. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of emotional discomfort. I've lived most of my adult life on the move, never staying in one place long enough to form lasting connections. It suited me, or I thought it did. He reached for her hand, enfolding it in both of his. But being here, with you, it's shown me something different. Something I didn't know I was missing. Olivia felt her pulse quicken at his words and the warmth of his touch. She wanted to respond, to tell him that his presence had breathed life back into her existence, that the thought of returning to solitude after knowing the comfort of his company was almost unbearable. But the words remained locked inside her, and the slate seemed woefully inadequate for expressing such complex emotions. Isaac seemed to understand her struggle. You don't need to say anything or write anything, he assured her. I just wanted you to know that this decision isn't easy for me, that leaving... He paused, his voice dropping. Leaving you isn't something I take lightly. Olivia closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. When she opened them, she withdrew her hand gently and picked up the slate. With careful deliberation, she wrote, I don't want you to stay out of pity or obligation. Olivia, no, Isaac said firmly. That's not... He stopped, frustrated by the limitations of words. What I feel for you has nothing to do with pity. Nothing. She studied his face, trying to read the emotions behind his amber eyes. After a moment, she wrote again. You should accept the position. It's your livelihood. He looked away, toward the fire. Yes, he acknowledged. It is. And refusing would mean finding different work. Perhaps settling in one place. He turned back to her. Which isn't impossible, just a significant change. The implication hung in the air between them. Olivia felt as though she stood at a crossroads, with no clear indication of which path to take. Part of her wanted to beg him to stay, to risk changing the course of his life for the possibility of something neither of them had named aloud. Another part feared the responsibility of such influence, worried that he might eventually resent her for anchoring him when his nature called him to wander. In the end, she wrote only, You have time to decide. Don't rush for my sake. Isaac nodded slowly. You're right. There's no need for hasty decisions. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. And this weather isn't going anywhere soon. We're likely snowed in for at least a day or two. The conversation shifted to more practical matters after that, but the undercurrent of unspoken emotions remained. As they prepared for bed, the routine that had become comfortably familiar now felt fragile, potentially finite. Olivia lay awake long after retiring, listening to the howl of the wind and wondering what the morning would bring. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because she woke with a start to brilliant sunshine streaming through her window. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Every surface outside was covered in pristine white, reflecting the morning light with dazzling intensity. Olivia dressed quickly and moved to the kitchen, finding Isaac already up and brewing coffee. He looked as though he hadn't slept well, but his smile was genuine when he saw her. "Good morning," he said. "Quite a change out there. Must be 8 or 9 inches at least." She nodded and moved to the window, taking in the beauty of the snow-covered yard and fields beyond. The world looked clean and new, all imperfections hidden beneath the white blanket. If only human concerns could be so easily covered over, she thought. They spent the morning clearing paths to the barn and chicken coop, working together in companionable silence. The physical labor was almost a relief after the emotional complexity of the previous evening's conversation. Neither mentioned Isaac's impending decision, though it hovered between them like a shadow. By afternoon, the sun had begun to melt the snow on exposed surfaces, creating a glistening, dripping world. Olivia sat on the porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl, watching as Isaac chopped more wood. His movements were fluid and powerful, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. She was struck by how deeply she had come to appreciate not just his help or his company, but his very presence, the way he moved through space, the sound of his voice, the expressions that crossed his face when he was thinking or amused or concerned. The thought of losing these daily observations made her chest ache with preemptive loss. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Isaac broke the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about what you wrote last night about not rushing the decision." He set aside the book he had been reading. "You were right, of course, but I realized today that while I was worrying about the future, I was missing the present." Olivia tilted her head questioningly. "What I mean is," he continued, "regardless of what happens next week or next month, we have now, this time together." He smiled softly. "And I'd rather spend it appreciating what is than fretting over what might be." She felt something in her chest loosen at his words. Reaching for her slate, she wrote, "Wise words. I've spent too long living in the past or fearing the future." "Then perhaps we can agree to focus on the present," Isaac suggested. "At least for a little while." Olivia nodded, a sense of relief washing over her. Whatever decision Isaac ultimately made, she could not control it. But she could choose to value the time they had, to store up memories of these days like preserves for the winter of his absence. The following days took on a golden quality, each moment seeming more precious for its potential impermanence. They fell into a rhythm of shared work and leisure, talking, or in Olivia's case, writing, about everything and nothing. Isaac told her more about his childhood, his brief and disastrous attempt at mining during the Colorado Silver Rush, his first job as a tracker guiding a group of botanists through Montana territory. In turn, Olivia found herself sharing more through her written words than she had with anyone since James's death. She wrote about growing up in Pennsylvania, the youngest of 5 children, often overlooked in the busy household. She described her first meeting with James at a church social, how his stories of the West had captured her imagination long before she fell in love with the man himself. And gradually, she began to write about the grief that had stolen her voice, the overwhelming sense of abandonment and futility that had descended when James succumbed to the fever, despite all her desperate prayers and care. Isaac listened with unwavering attention, treating her written words with the same respect he would have given spoken ones. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, but received each revelation with genuine interest and compassion. One evening, as the fire burned low and the cabin was wrapped in the deep silence that comes with heavy snow, Olivia found herself writing about the day she lost her voice. "It was at the funeral," she wrote, her chalk moving slowly across the slate. "I had been speaking before then, not much, but enough to handle the necessary arrangements. But when they lowered the coffin, something inside me just stopped. I opened my mouth to say goodbye, and nothing came out. Nothing has since. Isaac read her words carefully. Did it hurt? He asked gently. Physically, I mean. She considered the question. No, she wrote. It was like a door closing. The words are still inside, but they can't find their way out. Do you think they ever will? His voice was soft, without pressure or expectation. Olivia looked into the dying embers of the fire. I don't know, she wrote finally. For a long time I didn't care. Now. She hesitated, then added. Now. Sometimes I wish they would. Isaac reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I believe they will, he said simply. When you're ready. When the time is right. They sat like that, hands linked until the fire had nearly gone out. There was a comfort in the connection that went beyond words, spoken or written. The days continued to pass, each one bringing them closer to the deadline for Isaac's decision. Though they had agreed not to dwell on it, the approaching choice was impossible to ignore entirely. Olivia found herself watching him when he wasn't aware, trying to memorize the details of his presence, the way sunlight caught in his hair, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, the deep timbre of his laugh when something genuinely amused him. 5 days after the snowstorm, with the roads finally clear enough for travel, Isaac announced that he needed to ride into Clearwater Springs to send a telegram to the survey office. I need to give them an answer, he said over breakfast, his expression unreadable. One way or another. Olivia nodded, her heart pounding. She had promised herself she wouldn't try to influence his decision, wouldn't burden him with the weight of her growing feelings. He had his own life, his own path to follow. That their trails had crossed for this brief, precious time was something to be grateful for, not something to cling to desperately. She wrote, Do you want company for the ride? He smiled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I'd like that very much, if you're willing. They set out mid-morning under a clear blue sky, with fresh snow still blanketing the fields and clinging to the pine trees along the route to town. They rode side by side when the trail allowed it, with Isaac pointing out animal tracks in the snow: rabbit, fox, deer, and explaining how to read the stories they told about the creatures' movements and habits. Clearwater Springs was busy when they arrived, with freighters taking advantage of the improved weather to move supplies before the next storm. Isaac and Olivia stabled their horses at the livery, then walked together to the telegraph office. On the boardwalk outside, Isaac paused. Would you mind if I do this alone? He asked, his expression apologetic. I just need... Olivia touched his arm reassuringly and nodded her understanding. She wrote, I'll wait at the general store. Take your time. Relief crossed his face. Thank you. I won't be long. They parted, and Olivia made her way to Mrs. Miller's store, where she was greeted warmly by the proprietress. Mrs. Newell, what a pleasure to see you again so soon, and in this fine weather, too. Olivia smiled and nodded, moving to examine a display of fabric while Mrs. Miller attended to another customer. She tried not to think about what message Isaac might be sending at that moment, whether he was accepting the Arizona assignment or declining it. Either way, their comfortable existence was about to change, and the uncertainty made her stomach knot with anxiety. She was examining a bolt of blue calico when the store bell jingled, announcing a new arrival. Looking up, she saw Isaac standing in the doorway, scanning the interior until his eyes found her. He crossed to her side, his expression giving away nothing about the decision he had made. All done, he said simply. Are you finding something you like? Olivia indicated the fabric with a small shrug, unwilling to write a question about his telegram with Mrs. Miller potentially watching. That's a lovely color, he commented. Would suit you. She nodded, then wrote on her slate, Ready to head back? Actually, Isaac said, I thought we might have lunch at the hotel dining room if you're agreeable. I hear Mrs. Hampton makes an excellent beef stew on Thursdays. Olivia was surprised by the suggestion but nodded her acceptance. Whatever news Isaac had to share, good or bad from her perspective, it seemed he preferred to do it in a neutral setting rather than during the long ride home. They said goodbye to Mrs. Miller and walked to the small hotel at the end of the main street. The dining room was moderately busy with travelers and local businessmen, but they found a quiet table near the window. A middle-aged waitress took their order efficiently, bringing coffee while they waited for the food. Isaac seemed more relaxed than he had been earlier, chatting about the town's growth since his last visit several years before and pointing out changes he had noticed. Olivia responded with occasional written comments, but mostly she just observed him, trying to gauge his mood and what it might indicate about his decision. When their food arrived, beef stew for Isaac, chicken and dumplings for Olivia, they ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Finally, Isaac set down his spoon and looked directly at her. I sent my response to the survey office, he said, his voice low enough that nearby diners couldn't overhear. I told them I wouldn't be able to accept the Arizona assignment. Olivia felt her heart leap, but she kept her expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. I've been thinking a lot these past days, Isaac went on, about what I want, what matters to me. He smiled slightly. For most of my life, it's been the next horizon, the unexplored territory. Always moving, never settling. He reached across the table to touch her hand briefly. But recently, I've discovered there are other kinds of exploration, other territories worth discovering. His amber eyes held hers steadily. I've found something here with you that feels more important than any mountain vista or uncharted valley. Olivia's hand trembled as she reached for her slate. What will you do instead? She wrote, her chalk barely making legible marks. Well, that depends partly on you, Isaac replied. I've saved enough over the years to buy a small property. Not much, but enough to start with. He took a deep breath. There's a parcel of land for sale about 2 miles from your ranch, 50 acres with good water access and decent grazing. Olivia stared at him, hardly daring to interpret his words as she hoped. What I'm trying to say, Olivia, he continued, his voice gaining confidence, is that I'd like to stay in this area, to build something permanent for once in my life. He paused. And I'd like to continue seeing you, if you're amenable to that. She felt tears gathering in her eyes, not the tears of grief she had become so familiar with, but something new and fragile and hopeful. She wrote, I would like that very much. The smile that spread across Isaac's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I was hoping you'd say that. He leaned forward slightly. I know it's soon. I know you're still healing. I don't expect anything more than friendship for as long as you need. But I wanted you to know that I'm not going anywhere, not unless you ask me to. Olivia felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking on a river in spring. The warmth that flooded through her was almost painful in its intensity after so many months of emotional numbness. She wrote, I don't want you to go, then hesitated before adding, ever. Isaac read her words, and his eyes softened with emotion. Then I won't, he said simply. They finished their meal in a state of quiet joy, both aware that something profound had changed between them. The ride back to the ranch seemed shorter somehow, filled with Isaac's plans for the property he intended to purchase, and Olivia's written suggestions about local resources and potential improvements. As they approached her land, with the familiar silhouette of the ranch house visible against the late afternoon sky, Olivia was struck by how different it looked to her now, no longer a place of isolation and grief, but a home with a future, with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine for too long. Over the following weeks, Isaac divided his time between Olivia's ranch and the property he was in the process of purchasing. The former owner, an elderly man returning east to live with his daughter, was eager to sell, and the transaction proceeded smoothly. Isaac threw himself into planning improvements for the small cabin and outbuildings, often consulting Olivia on decisions and incorporating her suggestions. Their relationship evolved gradually, with an unspoken understanding that neither wanted to rush what was developing between them. Isaac continued to sleep in the spare bedroom when he stayed at Olivia's ranch, though their evenings together grew increasingly intimate in conversation, if not physically. They shared more of their histories, their dreams, their fears. Isaac through spoken words, Olivia through written ones. As winter settled fully over the Wyoming landscape, they established routines that accommodated both properties. Isaac repaired his cabin enough to make it habitable, though he spent more nights at Olivia's ranch than his own, especially when heavy snow made travel between the two places difficult. The townsfolk of Clearwater Springs observed the developing relationship with interest and generally approval. Mrs. Peterson remarked to anyone who would listen that Mr. Lawson has brought our Olivia back to life, while Sheriff Palmer noted that having a good man nearby will make things safer for the widow. If some gossip speculated about the propriety of their arrangement, most were silenced by Mrs. Miller's firm reminder that folks out here need to look after each other, and there's nothing improper about neighbors being neighborly. For Olivia, the transformation went deeper than anyone in town could see. With each day in Isaac's company, she felt more connected to the present and less haunted by the past. She began to take pleasure in simple things again, the taste of fresh bread, the beauty of a winter sunset, the satisfaction of completing a difficult task. She laughed more often, though still silently, her eyes crinkling and her shoulders shaking with mirth when Isaac shared a particularly amusing story or observation. And sometimes, when she was alone, she would touch her throat and try to form words, testing whether the door that had closed so firmly at James's funeral might be ready to open again. The results were disappointing only breath, sometimes a faint croak that bore no resemblance to speech, but she kept trying, drawn by a growing desire to express herself more fully than the slate allowed. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations for the holiday. Olivia found herself looking forward to the season for the first time since James's death. She baked cookies and made preserves for gifts, sewed new curtains for the cabin, and even ventured into town with Isaac to purchase small presents for neighbors and friends. On Christmas Eve, Isaac arrived at the ranch with a small pine tree tied to his saddle. "Thought we might bring a bit of the forest inside," he said, his cheeks ruddy from cold and his eyes bright with excitement. "If you'd like." Olivia's smile was answer enough. They set the tree in a bucket of sand in the corner of the main room and decorated it with paper stars Olivia had cut out, strings of dried berries, and a few precious glass ornaments that had belonged to her mother. When they finished, Isaac lit a candle and placed it carefully among the branches. "There," he said, stepping back to admire their work. "Not quite as grand as the trees I saw in Chicago once, but beautiful in its own way." Olivia nodded in agreement, then wrote, "It's perfect." They shared a simple but special supper of roast chicken, potatoes, and apple pie, with a small glass of whiskey that Isaac had brought for the occasion. As they sat by the fire afterward, Olivia presented Isaac with his gift, a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool that she had worked on secretly during the evenings. "Olivia, it's wonderful," he said, wrapping it around his neck immediately, and just in time for the coldest part of winter. He touched the careful stitches with appreciation. "I'll think of you every time I wear it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you. It's not much, but when I saw it, I thought of you right away." Olivia unwrapped the gift carefully to reveal a small silver locket on a delicate chain. The oval pendant was engraved with a simple design of intertwined leaves. Open it, Isaac encouraged softly. She did, finding two tiny compartments inside. One contained a miniature pressed flower, a mountain columbine, she realized. The same wildflower that had been growing near the creek, where she and James had first met, and which she had carried in her wedding bouquet. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Isaac questioningly. Mrs. Peterson told me about its significance to you, he explained gently. The other side is empty for now. I thought. He hesitated. I thought perhaps someday you might want to add something new. A memory we create together, perhaps? Olivia felt emotion well up in her chest, too complex and powerful to be contained. She clutched the locket tightly, overwhelmed by Isaac's thoughtfulness in acknowledging her past while also offering hope for their future. May I? He asked, indicating the necklace. When she nodded, he took it carefully and moved behind her chair to fasten it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. It suits you, he said as he returned to his seat. Olivia touched the locket where it rested against her collarbone, then reached for her slate. Thank you, she wrote, for understanding. After a moment's hesitation, she added, for everything. Isaac's smile was tender. You're welcome. And thank you, Olivia, for allowing me into your life. It's the greatest gift I could have received. He leaned forward in his chair, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes. May I kiss you? He asked softly. I've been wanting to for quite some time now. Olivia felt her heart flutter at the question. She nodded, setting aside her slate and leaning toward him slightly. Isaac bridged the remaining distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. It was brief, but full of promise, a beginning rather than a culmination. When he pulled back, his expression was a mixture of wonder and tenderness. Merry Christmas, Olivia, he whispered. She touched his cheek, wanting to return the words, feeling them form in her mind but unable to push them past the barrier that still held her voice captive. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him again, hoping he could feel what she couldn't say. That night, after Isaac had returned to his cabin, reluctantly, but insistent on propriety despite the late hour and falling snow, Olivia stood at her bedroom window watching the moonlight on the fresh snow. She touched the locket at her throat, thinking about the empty space inside it, waiting to be filled with a new memory. Merry Christmas, she whispered to the silent room, her voice a barely audible rasp after months of disuse. The words were malformed, hardly recognizable, but they were there, a crack in the wall of silence she had built around herself. Winter deepened, bringing heavy snows and bitter cold interspersed with brief periods of relative warmth. Isaac continued to divide his time between his own property and Olivia's, making improvements to both as weather permitted. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, with the unspoken understanding that their relationship was moving steadily towards something permanent, though neither rushed to define it precisely. In town, their connection was now accepted as established fact. Mrs. Miller referred to Isaac as Olivia's young man when he came to the store alone, and Mrs. Peterson had taken to casually mentioning available dates for spring weddings whenever the couple attended church together. Isaac handled such comments with good humor, neither confirming nor denying the assumptions, but always responding in ways that protected Olivia's dignity and privacy. For her part, Olivia found herself contemplating a future she hadn't dared imagine a few months earlier. The idea of sharing her life with Isaac no longer seemed like a betrayal of James's memory, but rather a continuation of the love she had known, different in character, but equally valid and true. She began to see that her heart had room for both the love she had lost and the love she was finding, that one did not diminish or replace the other. In private moments, she continued to practice speaking, though she shared this effort with no one, not even Isaac. Progress was frustratingly slow, a few raspy words at most, often followed by days when she couldn't produce any sound at all. But she persisted, driven by a growing desire to tell Isaac how she felt in her own voice, not just in written words. February brought a particularly severe cold snap, with temperatures dropping well below zero for nearly a week. Isaac had been staying at Olivia's ranch during this time, unwilling to leave her alone to manage in such dangerous conditions. They kept the fire burning constantly and hung extra blankets over the windows to block drafts, creating a warm cocoon against the harsh weather outside. On the coldest night, they sat close together on the sofa, wrapped in quilts and sipping hot cider. Isaac had been reading aloud from a book of poetry that had belonged to Olivia's mother, his deep voice giving rich texture to the verses. When he finished a particularly moving sonnet, he closed the book and looked at Olivia thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about the spring, about planting season." Olivia tilted her head questioningly. "My land has good soil for crops, according to the previous owner," Isaac continued. "I was considering putting in wheat, maybe some corn." He paused. "But managing two separate properties during planting and harvest will be challenging." She nodded, understanding the practical difficulties he was describing. "I've been wondering," he said, his voice taking on a careful quality, "if there might be a way to simplify things, to combine our efforts, so to speak." Olivia reached for her slate, which was never far from her these days. "What do you have in mind?" she wrote, though she suspected she knew where the conversation was heading. Isaac took a deep breath. "Olivia, I'm not a man who believes in wasting words or time. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. I've found something here with you that I never expected to find anywhere." He set aside the book and took her hands in his. "What I'm trying to say, not very elegantly, is that I love you. And if you could see your way clear to considering it, I'd like to ask you to marry me." Though she had sensed the direction of his thoughts, the actual words still took her breath away. She stared at him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I know it's soon," he continued when she didn't immediately respond. "I know you're still healing in many ways. And I would understand completely if you need more time. But I wanted you to know how I feel, and what I hope for our future." Olivia gently withdrew one hand from his and reached for her slate. With fingers that trembled slightly, she wrote, "I love you too." The smile that illuminated Isaac's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "You do?" She nodded, then wrote again, "But I'm afraid." "Of what, love?" he asked softly. "Of not being whole, of not being enough." She hesitated, then added, "Of not having a voice in our marriage." Isaac's expression grew serious. "Olivia, listen to me. You are whole. You are more than enough. And you have a voice, whether or not you ever speak aloud again." He touched the slate gently. "You communicate more clearly with these written words than many people do with hours of speech." She felt tears gathering in her eyes at his acceptance, his understanding of her deepest fears. "As for marriage," he continued, "that's a partnership that goes far beyond words. It's about actions, choices, the life you build together." He smiled slightly. "Though I admit, I do love the sound of your handwriting." The gentle joke broke the tension, and Olivia found herself smiling through her tears. She wrote, "Ask me again." Isaac looked surprised. Then understanding dawned in his eyes. He shifted to kneel before her, still holding one of her hands in his. "Olivia Newell, I love you with all my heart. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" She set aside the slate and nodded, her free hand moving to touch his cheek in a gesture that conveyed what words written or spoken could not fully express. Isaac rose and sat beside her again, gathering her into his arms. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for trusting me with your heart." They held each other for a long time, talking through written words and touches about their hopes for the future. They decided to marry in the spring, after the worst of winter had passed, but before the demands of planting season. Isaac would continue improving his own property, but they would live primarily at Olivia's more established ranch, combining their resources and efforts to make both properties thrive. When Isaac finally left for his own cabin the next morning, the temperature having risen enough to make travel safe, Olivia stood on the porch watching until he disappeared from view. Inside, she moved through the quiet rooms, touching objects that had once been solely hers but would soon be theirs, the table where they would share meals, the chairs where they would sit by the fire, the home they would build together. Isaac, she whispered to the empty house, her voice stronger than before, though still rough from disuse. Isaac Lawson. The name felt right on her lips, a promise of the future taking shape. News of their engagement spread quickly through Clearwater Springs, generating a wave of congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Peterson immediately appointed herself unofficial wedding coordinator, offering advice on everything from Olivia's dress to suitable Bible verses for the ceremony. Mrs. Miller insisted on ordering special fabric from Cheyenne for a new tablecloth as her gift to the couple. Even Sheriff Palmer expressed his approval, telling Isaac he was getting a fine woman, though you'd best treat her right, or answer to the whole town. March arrived with milder temperatures and the first hints of spring. Snow began to melt in sunny areas, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden for months. Birds returned from southern migrations, their songs providing a cheerful counterpoint to the dripping of melting icicles from the eaves. Olivia threw herself into wedding preparations with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, sorted through belongings to make room for Isaac's things, and worked on a special quilt for their shared bed. In quiet moments, she continued her private speech practice, determined to find her voice before the wedding if possible. Isaac divided his time between preparing his own property for spring planting and helping with projects at Olivia's ranch. They decided to expand the garden, repair the chicken coop, and add a room to the house for Isaac's books and maps. Each decision they made together felt like another stitch binding their lives more closely. 2 weeks before the wedding, Isaac arrived at the ranch with an unexpected gift, a beautiful chestnut mare with a white star on her forehead. "She's for you," he said, as Olivia admired the horse from the paddock fence. "The Morgan you have is getting older, and this girl has plenty of spirit but good manners. Thought she might make trips between our properties more enjoyable." Olivia stroked the mare's velvet nose, enchanted by the thoughtful gift. She had always loved riding but had done less of it since James's death, partly because her aging horse had also slowed down. This young mare represented new possibilities, new freedoms. "What will you name her?" Isaac asked, watching Olivia's face with pleasure. She considered for a moment, then wrote on her slate, "Hope." Isaac's smile was warm with understanding. "Perfect," he said softly. "Absolutely perfect." The following Sunday, after church services, Reverend Parker invited them to stay and discuss the wedding ceremony. In his small office behind the church, he reviewed the traditional service with them, explaining how they could modify it to accommodate Olivia's silence. "For the vows," he said kindly, "you can simply nod your agreement, Mrs. Newell, or write your responses if you prefer. The Lord hears the promises of our hearts as clearly as those of our lips." Olivia appreciated his sensitivity, but part of her still hoped desperately that she might find her voice before the ceremony. The thought of pledging herself to Isaac in silence, when her heart was so full of words she wanted to say to him, filled her with a determination she hadn't felt before. That night, alone in her bedroom, she practiced with more focus than ever. "I, Olivia," she whispered, the words scratchy but intelligible. "Take thee, Isaac." She repeated the phrases over and over, sometimes managing a full sentence, sometimes losing her voice partway through. It was maddening progress present one moment, gone the next, but she refused to give up. As the wedding day drew closer, Olivia found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey of the past year. From the depths of grief and isolation to the threshold of a new life, with a man she had come to love deeply, it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. She thought often of James, wondering what he would think of her choice. In her heart, she believed he would approve. James had been a man who embraced life fully and would have wanted the same for her, even after he was gone. The day before the wedding, Isaac spent the morning at his own property, completing some final preparations before the ceremony that would join their lives officially. He was due to return for supper, after which tradition dictated they would separate until meeting at the church the following afternoon. Olivia kept herself busy with last-minute tasks, arranging wildflowers in vases around the house, ironing her wedding dress, a deep blue silk that Mrs. Peterson had insisted was more suitable than black or gray, and preparing a special meal for their last evening as separate individuals. As she worked, she hummed softly another skill that had begun returning in recent weeks. The simple melody filled the kitchen, bringing a sense of rightness to the familiar space. This house that had known such sorrow would soon be filled with new life, new love. The thought made her pause in her work, overwhelmed by gratitude for the unexpected gift of second chances. When Isaac arrived in the late afternoon, his face lit up at the sight of her waiting on the porch. "There's my bride," he said, dismounting with his usual grace. "Looking more beautiful than ever." Olivia smiled and took his hand, leading him inside where the table was set with their best dishes and lit with candles despite the early hour. His expression of surprise and appreciation made the extra effort worthwhile. "You've gone to a lot of trouble," he said, taking in the special touches around the room. She handed him a note she had prepared earlier. "Our first meal as an engaged couple was stew by firelight. I wanted our last meal before marriage to be equally memorable." Isaac read it and looked up with emotion in his amber eyes. "You remember that first meal we shared?" She nodded, thinking of how far they had come from that day, when a dusty stranger had asked for water and offered to repair her fence in exchange for a place to sleep. They enjoyed the meal together, talking about the ceremony the next day and their plans for the immediate future. Isaac had arranged for one of the young men from town to care for both properties during their brief wedding trip to Cheyenne, where they planned to stay for 3 days before returning to the responsibilities of spring planting. As the evening drew to a close, Isaac reluctantly prepared to leave for his own cabin, where he would spend his last night as a bachelor. "This time tomorrow," he said as they stood on the porch, "you'll be Mrs. Lawson, if you still want to be, that is." His tone was light, but Olivia could detect a hint of genuine uncertainty beneath the humor. She reached up to touch his face, her eyes conveying what her voice could not. Then she took her slate and wrote, "I have never been more certain of anything." Relief and joy washed over his features. "Nor have I," he said softly, bending to kiss her with gentle passion. "I'll see you at the church tomorrow, my love." After he rode away, Olivia returned inside to prepare for bed. She laid out her wedding clothes for the morning, then sat at her dressing table, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at her was changed from the hollow-eyed ghost who had haunted these rooms months ago. There was color in her cheeks, life in her eyes, purpose in her expression. "Tomorrow," she whispered to her reflection, her voice stronger than it had been in her previous attempts. "Tomorrow I marry Isaac." Wedding day dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of warming earth and new growth. Olivia woke early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. She bathed and dressed carefully, arranging her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual simple braid, with small white flowers tucked into the coiled tresses. Mrs. Peterson arrived mid-morning to help with final preparations, bringing with her a small package. "Something borrowed," she explained, opening the box to reveal a delicate lace handkerchief. It was my mother's, and I carried it at my own wedding. I thought you might like to have it with you today. Olivia was touched by the gesture. She wrote a quick note of thanks and carefully tucked the handkerchief into her sleeve. At the appointed time, Sheriff Palmer arrived with his wagon to drive her to the church. "You look mighty fine, Mrs. Newell," he said with genuine admiration as he helped her onto the seat. "Mr. Lawson is a fortunate man." The small church was filled with familiar faces when they arrived. Nearly everyone from Clearwater Springs had turned out for the occasion. As Sheriff Palmer escorted her down the aisle, Olivia saw Isaac waiting at the altar, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to wonder as he caught sight of her. He looked handsome in a new suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his amber eyes fixed on her as she approached. Reverend Parker welcomed the congregation and began the ceremony with a prayer, followed by a brief homily on the nature of marriage as a partnership blessed by God. Throughout these preliminaries, Isaac held Olivia's hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm in a gesture of reassurance and connection. Finally, the moment arrived for the exchange of vows. Reverend Parker turned to Isaac first, leading him through the traditional promises to love, honor, and cherish Olivia for all the days of their lives. Isaac's voice was clear and firm as he repeated the sacred words, his eyes never leaving Olivia's face. Then it was Olivia's turn. As planned, Reverend Parker modified the procedure, asking her to indicate her agreement to each part of the vows with a nod. "Do you, Olivia Newell, take this man, Isaac Lawson, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Olivia took a deep breath, summoning all her determination and love. She looked directly into Isaac's eyes and opened her mouth. "I do," she said, her voice raspy but audible in the hushed church. A collective gasp rose from the congregation. Isaac's eyes widened in astonishment, then filled with tears of joy. Reverend Parker, after a moment of stunned silence, continued with the vows, his own voice thick with emotion. To each question, Olivia responded aloud, her voice gaining strength with each affirmation of her commitment to Isaac. When the time came to place the ring on his finger, she spoke the accompanying promise in a near whisper, but the words were clear. "With this ring, I thee wed." By the time Reverend Parker pronounced them husband and wife, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Isaac cradled Olivia's face in his hands, looking at her with a mixture of awe and adoration before kissing her tenderly. "You spoke," he whispered, as they turned to face the congregation as a married couple. Olivia nodded, her eyes bright with tears and triumph. "For you," she whispered back, her voice still rough but unmistakably hers, "for us." The celebration that followed at the town hall was joyous and heartfelt. Everyone wanted to congratulate the couple, not just on their marriage, but on the miracle they had witnessed. Olivia found herself speaking short phrases throughout the evening, "Thank you," and "Yes, indeed," and "I'm very happy," each utterance met with smiles of delight from those around her. Isaac stayed close by her side, his pride evident in every glance, every touch. "Don't tire yourself," he murmured at one point when she had been talking more than usual. "We have a lifetime for words now." As the evening drew to a close, they thanked their friends and neighbors for sharing in their special day. Sheriff Palmer drove them back to the ranch, where they would spend the night before departing for Cheyenne in the morning. As the wagon pulled away from the town hall, calls of congratulation and good wishes followed them into the gathering darkness. At the ranch, Isaac lifted Olivia from the wagon and carried her across the threshold of what was now their home. Inside, he set her gently on her feet, but kept his arms around her. "I have imagined this moment in so many ways," he said softly, "but never did I dream I would hear your voice on our wedding day. It was the most beautiful gift." "I wanted," Olivia began, her voice still halting but growing stronger with use. "I wanted you to hear me say the words. They were too important for silence. Isaac kissed her with reverence and building passion. "I love you, Olivia Lawson," he whispered against her lips. "Every day for the rest of our lives, I will thank God for bringing me to your door that summer morning." "And I will thank him," she replied, her voice breaking with emotion, "for giving me the courage to let you in." In the soft glow of lamplight, they began their married life with whispered words of love and promises for the future, a future neither could have imagined a year before, when a widow too broken to speak had allowed a wandering cowboy to sit beside her until, with patience and love, her words had found their way home. The years that followed were rich with both joy and challenge, as all lives are. Isaac and Olivia combined their properties and efforts, building a successful ranch that became known throughout the region for its fine horses and quality crops. Isaac's experience as a tracker proved invaluable in selecting the best grazing lands and water sources, while Olivia's practical knowledge of running a household and managing supplies ensured they weathered even difficult seasons with relative comfort. Olivia's voice grew stronger with time and use, though it always retained a slightly husky quality that Isaac claimed was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. She became known in Clearwater Springs not only for her resilience, but for her wisdom and compassion, often counseling other women facing loss or hardship. "Grief doesn't end," she would tell them, "but it changes. It makes room for joy to return, if you allow it." In their third year of marriage, they welcomed a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Isaac's mother. 2 years later, a son joined their family, James, in honor of the man whose memory Olivia continued to hold with love and respect. Isaac embraced this connection to her past, often telling the children stories about their mother's first husband and the ranch he had built with his own hands. "Our hearts have many rooms," he explained to Elizabeth when she was old enough to understand. "Your mother taught me that. Love isn't diminished by sharing, it's multiplied." On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Isaac presented Olivia with a journal bound in soft leather. "For your words," he said, "the ones you've found again, and the ones yet to come." Olivia filled those pages with the story of their life together, the quiet evenings by the fire, the children's first steps and words, the seasons of planting and harvest that marked the passing years. She wrote about the day a dusty traveler had stopped for water and changed the course of her life. And she wrote about the voice that had returned, when love gave her something that needed saying too urgently to remain silent. "Some people search their whole lives for a great adventure," she wrote on the final page. "I found mine when I stopped searching and started listening to the silence, to the land, to the man who sat beside me until I remembered how to speak." Our greatest journeys are often the ones that lead us home.